some cases, thank you so much to some of our panelists in particular for getting up so very early in the morning to join us on this event today. So welcome to this IBQC webinar on building products performance. My name is Dame Judith Hackett and I'm going to be chairing this event. And in a moment, I will introduce you to Judy, Neil, Bronwyn, Scott, Mohan and Shaheem, our illustrious panel for today. The event is being recorded for further sharing and further debate and engagement with other groups. So please note that as we move forward. I first want to say a few words of background about how this topic came to be the subject of our discussion today. The International Building Quality Centre is a group of senior people with a wide range of expertise relating to building safety. In one of our meetings well over a year ago now, we decided that a new area of focus for us should be the issue of building products performance. We were very much aware that in numerous parts of the world, some serious events had occurred in which the conformance and or compliance of building products had been called into question. Not least among these events was Grenfell Tower in London in 2017, but there have been others. The IBQC board set up a working group, which it has been my privilege to chair. We decided very early in our deliberations that this subject was both complex and sensitive. We could not simply gather and share good practice principles without first understanding much more about the nature of the problem, its prevalence or otherwise in different parts of the world, and an exploration of the causes of those problems where they exist. That led us to approach this work in a staged manner. The first step being to produce the discussion paper, which is now being published and which is the subject of our discussion today. And it is an exploration of the problem. Getting to this point has been challenging for us, more so than we anticipated at the outset. A number of you in your feedback so far have already identified areas which the paper does not cover. We thank you for that input very much, and I can assure you that we will build your thoughts and ideas into the planning of our next steps from here. But today, this discussion itself is an important step in opening up the debate. In a moment, I'm going to ask each of our panel members to introduce themselves and to speak for about 5 minutes each. Bronwyn's input will be slightly longer because it will include a summary of the key points in the paper as an aid memoir for you all. We will then initiate a discussion around some of the key issues and questions which have been raised by our paper so far. So we hope you find this interesting and stimulating. We will certainly be looking for your feedback. If you do have any questions during the course of this webinar, please enter them into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, which we will be monitoring. And now I'd like to hand over to the first of our panel members. Neil, over to you.
Thank you, Dame Judith. My name is Neil Savory. I, up until recently, was the Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Building Codes Board, and I'm currently doing some consultancy work for the International Code Council. In my role as CEO of the Australian Building Codes Board, following the La Crosse fire in Melbourne, which some of you will be familiar with in 2014, the issue of building products became paramount in consideration by building ministers as to what was the cause of that particular incident and whether or not it was more prevalent throughout the Australian building industry. And so I've had an interest and, of course, a responsibility to try and address these issues since that time. The purpose of my presentation is to talk about the experience in Australia and similarities with evidence emerging in the UK, particularly through the various inquiries relating to the Grenfell Tower fire. So just to start with, I think it's important that when we're talking about building product performance, we're typically talking about whether or not products are fit to be used for their intended purpose. There are various definitions, but that's the fundamental. I think it's also important to note that in referring to products, we're also including building product systems that may feature a number of discrete products within them. Where failures occur, based on the work that's been done here and elsewhere, there appear to be two obvious problems with a number of contributing factors. There are those products that would appear to be deliberately marketed for a use when they do not conform with the requirements that need to be satisfied for a particular application. There are also then those products that meet certain standards and have been tested for specific applications, but are used incorrectly and in circumstances where they shouldn't be by building practitioners. In other words, the products are being used in a manner that is non-compliant. Now, unlike other sectors in the economy, the performance or risk associated with a building product is determined not just by its characteristics, but also its application. So that makes this a far more complex proposition, as Dame Judith mentioned, than perhaps in other sectors. So this combination of factors makes it critical for products to perform to the necessary standards, be specified, approved, and installed by competent practitioners, reliably supplied, and correctly maintained. So there are some of the potential cues to where some of the problems have been identified. Now, when considered alongside the sheer volume of products used in a building, and we could be talking thousands and tens of thousands of products, the combination of product characteristics and its applications make it virtually impossible to put some sort of mandatory control system over the top of all of that, i.e. mandatory product certification schemes, as one example. Now, whilst ACPs and ACMs have attracted the bulk of attention as a result of the high-profile fires that we've talked about, Grenfell and La Crosse, they are not the only products that have been identified as either exhibiting non-conforming or used in a non-compliant manner. And just by way of example, fire doors, fire collars, roof ties, balcony glazing, electrical cables, and lead in some plumbing products that exceed specified standards have all been recent examples of these types of product performance issues. Often the problem has been simplified to a focus on products that do not conform with building product requirements and standards, as was the case, for instance, with the Senate inquiry into non-conforming building products in Australia. But our further exploration of these issues would or does suggest that there are other factors. So just to look at that in a bit more detail, the analysis around product failure and product performance has involved issues like product supply chain, practitioner conduct and competence, the regulatory system itself in terms of shortcomings around auditing and accountability frameworks, project management objectives and client objectives where that might result in cost cutting, the adequacy of product testing standards and certification regimes, product information and traceability, and adequate and correct maintenance. Governments in the UK and Australia, as we know, have commissioned reports like the Hackett Report, the Shergold-Weir Building Confidence Report, which of themselves have identified potential shortcomings in processes and practices that may contribute to the adequacy of building product assurance. One of these, for instance, being adequate documentation, another being effective regulatory oversight. Now, just in closing, a couple of other observations. one of the interesting topics of discussion arising out of the ACP ACM debate has been the use of performance solutions or alternate solutions to demonstrate product compliance. Neither of the two reports that I've just mentioned recommend making changes to the use of performance-based codes. And in Australia, at least, audits of those buildings that have been found to have non-compliant external wall cladding have found overwhelmingly that these have been installed through the use of deemed to satisfy or prescriptive solutions. Lastly, the nature of the problem also appears to be magnified in the building sector in at least these two countries, that is Australia and the UK, as a result of the construction process representing what can be described as an open system of production. That is a system with multiple actors, multiple responsibilities, often in the absence of client representation, outsourced regulatory oversight, and product supply coming from multiple sources to be assembled on site, all of which have the potential to reduce effective quality assurance practices. Thank you, Dame Judith.
Neil, thanks very much. Judy, would you like to pick up the baton from there, please?
Yes, thank you. And Neil's comments led nicely into the things that I'm going to be talking about as well. My name is Judy Zakreski, and I'm the Vice President of Global Services for the International Code Council. I was a participant in this working group, and really approaching this topic from the U.S. perspective, which has not has had multiple building failures, of course, throughout our history, but not a large scale facade fire that resulted in an inquiry like those in Australia and the UK that sort of gave rise, as both Dame Judith and Neil have shared, to the work of this group. I'd just like to share a little bit about my observations about the difference in the United States, which has spawned my interest in this work. And so unlike in most countries, in the United States, building safety is decentralized with each state, and in some cases, individual cities determining how building safety will be regulated. So there's no national building code in the United States. There's no national ministry that's responsible for building safety. And instead, as constitutionally mandated, building codes and standards in the United States are developed through a public-private partnership underwritten by private NGOs and determined at the state level. So ICC, the International Code Council, is one of those NGOs that develops model building codes and standards. And to do that, we use an open consensus-based process, similar to what many would be familiar with standards development. We also provide services that help jurisdictions to implement and enforce building safety regulations, whether or not those regulations are based on the model ICC building codes. It's also interesting to note that the accreditation of testing labs and product certification bodies in the United States is also a private sector function, with a number of ILAC and IAF accredited accreditation bodies serving the US market. Enforcement, as in many countries in the United States, is the responsibility of local jurisdictions. There is widespread use of private third-party inspectors, plan reviewers, and enforcement officials. But in the United States, they're always acting on behalf of the jurisdiction, with the jurisdiction holding ultimate responsibility for auditing and overseeing their work. Now, since the United States system is different in many ways from the countries that have initiated these investigations into performance failures that involve building products and their regulation, I was keen to get involved in the work of this committee for many reasons, but predominantly, I wanted to understand more about the underlying causes of the problems that were being uncovered in the investigations, particularly in Australia and the UK. I wanted to ensure that the work produced did not automatically imply a universal problem. It could very well imply a universal problem, but I didn't want to automatically jump to that conclusion. And I'm also still very interested in understanding whether the structure of the US building safety regulatory system makes it more effective, or as some have suggested, if in the United States we're facing an imminent failure of building products. In other words, not that we won't have a problem, but the question of when will we have a similar problem? And that remains an open question. Now, certainly the US system is imperfect, and we've had our share of tragic building failures. But in most, if not all of the high profile cases, the causes were not found to be the result of collusion between manufacturers and conformity assessment bodies to game the system. The US society also is extremely litigious, which could play a role in motivating the various actors, both in the public and private sector, within the building safety ecosystem. So I'm really interested now to see a broad global dialogue that recognizes documented failures in one market and examines regulation in other markets to see if the root causes are also present there, and to uncover what protections are effective and to find ways to leverage those protections, to help improve building safety globally, which is the mission of the International Code Council. I'm also interested to have a non-accusatory and non-judgmental dialogue that seeks to engage all players in the building safety ecosystem, a dialogue that doesn't vilify an entire industry for missteps or illegal behavior by individual players. I applaud the IBQC for exploring this important issue and to reaching out to stakeholders in the building safety space globally to identify solutions. So I'm pleased to be joined on this panel today by several colleagues who represent various important actors in the US building safety ecosystem who know far more about this than I do. And I will defer most of the US comments to them. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, and I look forward to a very interesting discussion, both today and as the dialogue continues to unfold following this workshop. I also look forward to continuing the important work on this project. As Dame Judith said, we're really just getting started, and there's a lot more to accomplish. And so we thank everyone for joining us in this important journey. Thank you, Dame Judith.
Thanks, Judy. Now I'm going to hand over to Bronwyn, who's also going to share some slides as part of what she has to discuss.
Okay. Looks like I am going to stop that. Apologies. Okay, I think that's it. Let's go like that.
Yeah,
All
we
right.
can see that.
You can see that now. Thank you. Apologies for that little delay. So thank you for having me here today, and again, a nice segue into my work and to my presentation today. So my name's Bronwyn Weir. I'm a lawyer. I've been advising governments on how to regulate for coming up 25 years, and have a particular interest in building regulation, but also in regulation more generally. Just wanting to go through in summary how we put the report together, and both the previous speakers already today have touched on some of the key issues that we identify in the report. But to summarise the approach we took, we opened the paper that we've prepared, really providing a bit of context and background for what we're trying to achieve, which has been mentioned today by Dame Judith, in the sense that this is the first paper on this topic that seeks to identify problems or issues that are associated with building product performance. And we hope that after having some dialogue and input from important stakeholders globally, that we will be in a position to move forward to produce best practice guidance for regulating these issues and addressing these problems and the points that we've identified through the paper and through our consultation. What we recognise in the paper is that this is not an area that is unregulated in most countries, in particular most developed countries. It is, building product performance is already subject to quite sophisticated controls, even in the two countries, Australia and the UK, where we've most recently seen inquiries and other evidence of problem behaviour and non-compliance. And so we're not seeking to say that what we have in place needs to be completely dismissed and started again. We're simply needing to look at the weaknesses in those current controls and examine how it is that these failures have occurred. We also in the paper touch on some of the evidence, and it's really important to point out that whilst we refer to the UK and Australia for examples, we also refer briefly to some examples we found in Nigeria. We did look further afield than that and sought to research other parts of the world that might have produced reports or other literature discussing the issues of building product performance. We didn't come up with material from other parts of the globe, but we're very interested if there are some, and if there are people who watch this meeting today and can provide us with examples of other reports from other countries, we'd be very interested to see that material. So with this backdrop, we then moved in the paper to identifying what the issues were, and we've characterised those under 10 different headings. So the first one is the issue that's created by the sheer volume and the supply chains that have developed around building products. Of course, the world has become a lot smaller in terms of the supply of materials, and that has led to an increased lack of transparency in where materials can come from, and an increased volume of materials. Of course, people purchase over the internet now, as well as bringing products into countries through importers and so forth. So this creates an issue in and of itself with the sheer volume and the length of those supply chains that have become much longer in the last couple of decades. The second issue is around the lax compliance culture, and again, we draw here heavily from the evidence that has come out in the public inquiry to date, reflecting the fact that in some cases and some actors within the manufacturing and product supply industry have quite deliberately set out not to comply and in fact to game the system. That of course does not reflect all of the actors in the manufacturing and supply of building products, but these are quite notable instances that have come through the public inquiry and through the Senate inquiry in Australia in terms of people, certain operators seeking to deliberately deceive and mislead as to the performance of their product or the adequacy of testing that has been applied to justify or promote the use of their product. The third issue that we identify is around standards and code development, and this is quite a lengthy part of the discussion paper because there's a number of issues to unpack here. Firstly, the question of having standards and codes for so many products that might exist within the building industry or be used in the construction of buildings. Of course, there is this whole question of whether it is possible to have a standard for every single component or element or system that might be used. But there's also then the issue of when we do have standards, are they adequate? And we refer in the paper to some commentary from leading experts around whether or not the full-scale testing standards for facades, for example, are testing for the right outcomes and performance and how much they can be relied on. And this has been a topic of quite some discussion in academic literature. There is also the process for the development of codes and standards, the involvement of industry, and the extent to which that involvement might be influenced by things other than a broader sense of public safety, and how to moderate and ensure that in the development of standards, that really important and critical input from industry is tempered by an overarching obligation to ensure public safety and a work in progress in terms of the continued improvement of standards and quality and safety. So this one really is quite detailed in terms of one of the 10 issues. The fourth issue is around, again, another quite a meaty issue around accreditation processes and bodies. And so how is it that we should accredit bodies to do testing against the standards, and what sorts of controls need to be in place to make sure that those bodies are not influenced or corrupted, I guess, by some of the behaviours we identify in issue 2, but also to make sure that those bodies have high levels of competence and ability within them to be able to test and certify what are at times very innovative products that need some consideration in terms of their ability to meet standards and particularly outcomes-based regulation. Product substitution is topic number 5 that we raise in the paper, and this of course goes to the practice of looking for alternate products that may have been specified, and sometimes for very legitimate reasons, particularly in the current climate where post-COVID, particularly in Australia, we're having enormous issues being able to get product from international suppliers, and this gives rise to the need for product substitution. And the issue around this is, how is that process done? Are there sufficient checks and balances to ensure that the products being substituted remain suitable for use and have high levels of evidence of suitability and are not being substituted for substandard products? Issue number 6 is the issue of product installation. So here in the paper, we're obviously not just talking about individual elements, but also systems, and sometimes products can be comprised of a number of elements and the methodology for actually constructing that system and putting it together is critical to how it will perform. So wall systems or facade systems are, again, another good example of this. So we have varying degrees of instruction that are given by product manufacturers for how to install their systems, which can lead then to inappropriate installation and therefore a lack of performance in terms of what might have been intended for a product system. Here too, we might also question the quality of education that is given to the installers of products or to others in the supply chain who are involved in ensuring that we do have product installation done correctly to achieve those intended levels of performance. And that segues into issue 7, which is around the role of the specifiers, the designers and the approval bodies. So often building certifiers or other building control bodies who are really the gatekeepers for what should be approved to be used. And so here, we've seen evidence from the Grenfell inquiry around potential, I guess, inability to, with this group, to properly identify what is suitable for use and to properly consider a range of different regulatory requirements. So perhaps there's been more of a focus on energy efficiency goals rather than fire safety goals in the case of the ACM, ACP issues, as an example. Issue number 8 is around regulatory oversight, and Neil's touched on this. This is the adequacy, the resourcing and the capacity of regulators to properly regulate and oversight these systems of control. And certainly there's been some criticism of that in Australia, and the work that I was involved in assessing our compliance and enforcement systems in this country did conclude that we have inadequate regulatory practice and oversight for a range of reasons. And this is really another area that means that the system of regulation of building products can come undone. Topic number 9 is the inadequate quality assurance during construction. So here it's around what inspections are required, the methodology for installation and who's overseeing that and signing off on those activities. And last but not least, of course, is maintenance and servicing post-construction and how a lack of appropriate maintenance can lead to products deteriorating or not continuing to perform or comply through lack of servicing or maintenance controls. So they're our 10 issues, and I'll hand back now to Judith to continue the presentation.
Bronwyn, thanks very much indeed. So you've heard now from 3 of our panel members, not all of the panel by any means. There are other people who we need to thank for their input to the work that we've done so far, and they're all credited in the report itself. But as Judy mentioned, we now have some experts in other parts of the product performance process from the US who we're delighted to have with us. And I'm going to ask Shaheem to speak first, please.
Judith, thank you so much for the opportunity. My name is Shaheem Moinian. I'm the president of ICC Evaluation Service. ICC Evaluation Service is the certification body leg of the International Code Council. I'm a mechanical engineer by training, licensed in the states of California and Florida. First off, I want to mention that it is my belief that this paper that IBQC has written is well written, and it has attempted to identify and discuss the many problems. The paper states that the purpose is to examine how regulations can be used to ensure product compliance and the use of products for the intended use or intended application. I was going to go through some of the items that have been brought up in the paper, but before getting into that, I want to get into the system that we have in North America, in the US in particular. I have to mention that the system, in my view, is a good system. It's not perfect, but it's a good system. The system basically has many elements that revolve around the final product, which is the product approval by an authority having jurisdiction with peace of mind. The system at the apex of it has the accreditation, and the accreditation is basically based upon an ISO Casco standard 17011. The accrediting bodies, as a result of them following 17011, accredit a variety of entities such as standard development organizations that come up with codes, standards, normative documents, and other criteria. They also accredit testing laboratories to ISO 17025, inspection agencies to ISO 17020, personnel certification to ISO 17024, which basically addresses the competence of the authorities having jurisdiction who actually, at the end of the day, approve products for installation. And then there's another important aspect to one of the standards, which is ISO 17065, which gets into the scheme. Scheme is defined in the ISO 17000 as a set of rules and procedures that describe the object of conformity assessment, identifies the requirements, and provides methodology to perform conformity assessment. Now, all of these are covered by the ISO Casco Toolbox standards. These activities all are based upon sampling, and that's probably a weakness in the system because you cannot evaluate the entire population of products or the entire population of inspectors and so on. But still, the system is in place, and in a way, I have to say that it works in an adequate manner. Now, given that, I want to address some of the things that have been addressed in the paper. It talks about Grenfell, and it basically says that the building did not adequately resist the spread of fire, having regard to the height, use, and the position of the building. And it goes on to say that the industry was misled about the fire performance of their product and a few other things. The codes in North America have a variety of requirements as a result of them being consensus codes and being in compliance with ISO 17007 that may mitigate disasters like this. Some of the requirements are means of egress, sprinklers, and the like. The paper goes on to talk about installation issues. The International Building Code, which is in North America, has some requirements for special inspections. Special inspectors require they're required to be competent and those are the ones that approve products for installation. There's a whole chapter in the International Building Code dedicated to this matter. The paper talks about specifiers and designers. I know that the building code in the United States, the digital version of it, has attached to it or linked to it products that have met the requirements of the code and the applicable standards. So that actually is a good guidance for designers to specify products that comply with the requirements of the standard. But having said this, the next step still is important in case the designers miss and do not specify products that are in compliance. Then the regulators need to also make sure that the products that are that they're approving that have met the certain requirements of codes and standards that are applicable to those products. The paper also talks about lack of service and maintenance post-instruction. That is a very important point, and I think that probably caused the disaster in Florida. Standards do cover certain things like durability and life cycle analysis for products, and those are again covered by the ISO 17007 standards. Looking at what happened in Grenfell Tower and some of the elements that we've discussed above, it is hard to ascertain if the system that I just mentioned to you would have prevented the catastrophe, but there's certainly a possibility of that. And with that, I thank you for the time you've given me.
Shaheen, thank you very much. Thank you, and we'll come back to you with some of our questions later. I'd now like to move on, and our next speaker will be Mohan. You're on mute, Mohan.
Yes, you know, after 2 years of doing this, I still
There's always one.
yes. What is it? Thank you for having me on board here. Really appreciate the paper, as Shaheen mentioned, is very well written and does bring up a lot of interesting concepts. The key concept that I see being referred to many times is accreditation, and also Bronwyn, you know, spoke about accreditation. The thing is that accreditation confers, you know, accreditation is a third party. Third-party auditing and independent auditing, and it confers basically on the product traceability. And traceability is very important because it's traceability of the product either to the SI units as form of a measurement or traceability to legal metrology, where you pay, where a payment is required for a particular measurement. Like say when you go to the gas station and you put a gallon of gas, you pay for a gallon of gas. So that's legal metrology. So accreditation allows these types of traceabilities to be conferred upon the product. May I share one slide, because I have heard Judy mentioned a little bit about ILAC and IAF, and I think that it will add value if everybody very quickly has a quick grasp of what accreditation and international conformity assessment structure is. Is that acceptable to them? Okay.
If Judy can make that happen, it's fine by me.
Yes, thank you. Okay.
You should be able to share now, Mohan.
Okay. Yes. And can everybody see that slide, please?
Not yet.
Not yet? Okay. And how about now?
No.
No, it's still not up there.
Okay, that's all right. Then I will show
Mohan,
it.
you speak to it rather than showing the slide, if you wouldn't mind, please.
No problem. No problem. I can do that. So what happens is that Judith mentioned about ILAC and IAF, and ILAC is the International Laboratory Accreditation Corporation, and IAF is the International Accreditation Forum. These are the two conglomerations in the world that have all the accreditation bodies underneath them. And they provide, these accreditation bodies under ILAC and IAF provide the 17025 testing or the 17065 product standard, and 17020, the inspection standard. And these are the three main standards used in the building world. You either test a product for something, or if you're building a product, then you provide the testing to ensure that the specifications are met, and then you provide the inspection to ensure that the product is repeatedly, molded and formed in a manufacturing company. So that's where accreditation sits, and I wanted to show you the structure, but we can do that later. But in general, that's what accreditation does. And sometimes, like Shaheen said, accreditation is a sampling exercise. So you have 1,000 products, you pick 10 products, you perform, the assessor performs the evaluation on those. Now, it doesn't mean that the 11th product is not functioning or is functioning. So you just do a sampling exercise, and in most cases, the sampling exercise is statistically done to ensure that the products are good. So along the way, there are many processes. Now, any one of those processes could go wrong. Sometimes when a process leaves the manufacturer or the company that is distributing it, then the product could have failures due to transport. So there are a lot of issues that goes to any product failing, and that product failing could cause disasters. So that's basically what I wanted to start everybody off with accreditation. Thank you, Judith.
Thanks very much, Mohan. And now to our final speaker who has to introduce himself. We move now to Scott, please.
Hey everybody, my name is Scott Miller. I am a professional engineer here in the United States, registered in, 45 plus states, I believe. Been in this field for 25 years, and I represent, I guess, the building industry. And I work for a company called MyTech, and where I've served as a design engineer for a number of years, and for the last several years have been deeply involved in new product development. And so over that time, I've had the opportunity to really, I guess, come in as an observer of what it's like to deliver a product through the process to bring into the market. And so I thought I would kind of just speak to that for a little bit. And just for the record, I've been involved in this panel now for 3 weeks, so I haven't had the experience of doing a lot of the research that some of the others on this have had. And it's been really interesting to listen, read the paper first, and then to listen to some of the comments and observations that have been made so far. So again, I can mostly speak from my own personal experience. And so as I've worked with ICCES and other product approval companies like them, what I've really experienced is a very rigorous process. And it starts with the development of these ASTM standards that we have that are consensus-based documents that are used to develop products and test against. And after these ASTM standards are developed, then we have something, when you're working with ICCES particularly, a thing called an acceptance criteria that is published. And again, it's consensus based, and so you've got academia can weigh in on it. You've got different people from industry. You've got some of the engineers working at ICCS involved in it. So you've got a good representation of different experts weighing in on the development of this acceptance criteria that your product is going to, again, be measured against. Then after that's published and we start to develop a product and bring it to market and work with ICCES or one of their competitors, and we develop a quality control manual. We then have to do third-party testing and that is by another company, we'll say, for example, NCA, who comes in, and if we perform the tests, which we typically do in our own labs, they come in, they calibrate our instrumentation, they witness the testing, they then write the report on the what they've observed in the testing, and then that's given to ICCES, who would then in turn also do inspection of our quality control manual to edit that and make sure it's in line. And then they'll make factory inspections to make sure that our factories are making the product correctly and according to our QC manual. After all of that, then they create an ESR report that outlines the structural values of our products or other values of our products, how it's to be installed, its intended use. All of that information is there. And then we label our product with that ESR report number so that anyone downstream has the ability to see all of the information, the values, the installation instructions, all those different things. And then I think another important step in the process then is yet another third party is involved, and that is the either plan reviewer and or inspector in the field to ensure that the product is being incorporated into the building design as per its intended use, and then finally the building inspector on the job site who reviews the product to make sure it's installed correctly. In preparation for today's conversation, I've done some research in how this is done in other countries to try to understand and compare and contrast. And I'll not go into the same detail that I just did with my own experience with the U.S. system, but I'll just say that there, especially in the regions where Mytech does business, which is Australia, New Zealand, UK, other European countries, I'll say it's at least in the same spirit as that process. And so all that rigor, I'll just say, makes me feel really safe when I walk into buildings today. So when I hear the paper, I guess I always think about, okay, what's the background? Why is someone writing a paper like they did? Where's the tone coming from? And the first thing I've just got to say is I just want to be respectful because people have been injured or worse. And so I just, anything that I say, I want to start there and just be respectful to those people. And when I hear tone like the problem, it sounds like it's pervasive, and, that it's just all over the place. And I just want to say that my experience, and when I talk about everything that we go through as a manufacturer, I'm going, boy, I have a hard time thinking that it would be that pervasive. And so I think about where have I seen potential problems? And again, I've only been involved in this conversation for a couple of weeks, and I'm only really able to look at this from my observations. I haven't done months and months of research as you guys have, the rest of the panelists. But I see things like products that I'll just say look like products that we sell that are for sale on the internet. And I'm going, okay, and they don't necessarily have an ESR report. Now, do they get used? That I don't know. I have no idea if anyone buys those products or if they're just available, but I know that they're there. The other thing I'll speak to is installation, and where have I actually seen problems? And I have seen problems with products being misinstalled, and I know that because we get called, and so the building official will catch things and we'll get called to come out, and then we'll do an inspection and see if the product is installed in a way that it's okay or not. And as professional engineers, we will, make that observation and deem that product has been installed in a way that is okay. Like say they use the wrong nails. We can do hand calculations and verify, has that been, is it okay or not? And sometimes it'll have to be reinstalled, or, something has to be fixed. But that's where that final step of inspection is so key in the U.S. system, and that those inspectors know what to look for. So the thing that I don't know is, are there times when it doesn't get caught? And, things are maybe installed incorrectly that don't get caught because the inspector doesn't know what they're to look for. I don't know, because it would be negative, which I can't do. So again, those are just my own personal, I guess, experience and observations. And so with that, I'll just say thank you very much for having me today.
Scott, thank you. Thank you. I think, as Bronwyn said earlier, no one is trying to suggest that this problem is all pervasive, and that we have a world full of poor players and bad actors. But I think the experience of both the Australian and UK systems are that it takes one catastrophic failure to destroy confidence. And there is something about the fact that one major failure causes people to question how good is our system if this can go on. So with that as our starting point, I now want to start the discussion among the panel. Thank you all for your input to this point. Lots of interesting points come up already, which I'm going to try and wrap into some of my questions. The first one, though, is that I think for many of us, and certainly for people who are listening to this debate perhaps for the first time, the fact that the paper draws a distinction between compliance and conformance needs a little bit more explanation. Neil, you uncovered some of that in what you said, but I really look to you and Bronwyn, I think, to help to perhaps say a little bit more about this important distinction between when is non-compliance a problem and when is it about non-conformance, because I think that's part of the complexity that we uncovered as part of our deliberations. Neil, do you want to go first?
Happy to. And this did form a very key part of our evidence to the Senate inquiry on non-conforming building products. So what I want to just reinforce, at its simplest, non-conformance is essentially fraudulent product. That is product that does not meet the required standards it claims to, and therefore product that misleads practitioners and consumers. Non-compliant product, on the other hand, is product used for purposes different to the standards that product might satisfy and the claims of its specifications. The primary cause of non-conformance, in my opinion, and based on the work that we've done, will typically arise from a manufacturer or distributor of a product supplying to the market with misleading claims and misinformation. So really fundamental consumer law sort of issues. On the other hand, the non-compliant use of a product could occur for a number of reasons. It may be deliberate cost cutting, product substitution, as Bronwyn mentioned earlier. It could be through inadequate information that the practitioner doesn't have access to. It could be possibly as a result of poor practice and oversight. And I think we have to be upfront. It could just be an honest mistake that someone makes. Not to excuse it, but mistakes happen. As noted in the paper, such distinctions are not necessarily confined to the building and construction industry, but the system of production that I mentioned before, and in some cases inadequate regulatory oversight and accountability, creates the potential for buildings to have a higher level of exposure. Thank you.
Thanks, Neil. That's really helpful. Bronwyn.
I mean, Neil's given a great explanation. I don't think I can improve on that. But what I will say is that one of the reasons why this is important is because when you're looking at the regulatory response, you really need to consider those, I guess, triggers for these to types of non-conformance and non-compliance, and also understand that things like banning products won't necessarily solve the issue and become a bit like whack-a-mole. We might decide to ban a certain product from use, and of course that will stop it being used and alleviate the harm for that product, but it doesn't stop another product from being the same mistakes happening. And so really you're trying to address the underlying reason why this occurs, as opposed to the silver bullet approach that sometimes governments are enamoured by as a quick fix. And so that's really the only thing I would add to that discussion.
Thank you. I guess one of the other points I think your whack-a-mole analogy is a good one, and one of the things that always occurs to me when we talk about this as well is that we should remember that perhaps in all of this that the potential vulnerability of developing countries where their regulatory systems are not as well developed, and if we simply ban products in the developed world, where are they going to go? Are we actually stopping their production, or are we just moving their source of use? So I think that is something that certainly we need to explore as we take this work forward. I'm now going to move on to this difficult question of responsibilities, and who should take responsibility for that? We've heard a lot about accreditation systems, about the important role of inspectors, the industry itself behaving ethically and not misleading, and so on. One of the things that really comes across to me in all that people have said, and the 10 points that we looked at in the paper, which show just how complex it is and how many different ways in which a failure can occur. Is it possible for any one individual or one organisation to be responsible, or do we have to have a matrix of responsibilities for ensuring conformance and compliance? And I'd like to turn first of all to Scott. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think, again, I'm going to go back to my experience, and I'm going to say that the fact that our products are developed through that matrix is part of what makes me feel safe. And the fact that there's so many different third parties and accreditation services, all these different points, to me, instead of just one single thing, makes it, I'll say, more rigorous. Because if you only had one thing, if that one thing fails, then the whole thing fails. By having all of these different points of contact, there's more catches, more checks and balances to ensure that things are safe.
Okay, thank you. Mohan.
Thank you. On this question, I'd say, the responsibility, I like the word that you used, the matrix of responsibility lies on the full supply chain. I think it could go wrong anywhere. But I think more importantly, I think you trust but verify. And I think that's the key point for consumers and users who use that product when they are trying to conform. The other thing that I want to just very quickly say is that just because a product does not conform doesn't mean that it's a fraudulent product. It could be misinterpreted, it could be misunderstood, and could be used by untrained folks that may have resulted in such issues. But the use of the word fraudulent is a very sensitive and it's a very debatable term. So I just want to put that out in the.
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay. Thanks for that. Anyone else want to come in on this subject of responsibilities and chains of responsibility?
Yes. I wouldn't mind sort of actually just reflecting on the relationship between what a regulator can do and what industry itself can do. I think that regulators have to perform effectively, and they have to be well resourced. They have to be proactive in the way that they oversee and enforce legislation and educate the regulated entities, and they play a really important role. But if the industry itself lacks integrity and ethical standards and that ability to do the right thing even when not being checked by a regulator, then a regulator will never win the battle. So we have to find ways for industry to self-sustain its own integrity, and for associations and others to call out and create benchmarks and ensure that their members are behaving appropriately, without necessarily thinking that this can all be solved through better regulation.
Thank you. Thank you. What that reminds me very much of, and I was interested in the comments that were being made about sampling, and the fact that we do all of this by sampling. What that normally means is you test a product once, and then that product has approval. My concern, based upon my experience in other industries, is how products evolve over time, and whether or not there is a creeping change process in some of the products that are introduced into the marketplace, whether it's a change of raw materials, a change of sourcing of some of those raw materials, or whatever it might be. Is there a case for periodic retesting and random sampling in the process?
Shaheen,
Neil, you're nodding.
Oh,
I'll come to you, Shaheen, in a moment.
No worries.
Neil,
No, I think, Dame Judith, absolutely. And a competent regulatory system should, in fact, have that built in, that there will be regular sampling, retesting, so that a certificate, for instance, of a product will require that product to be retested. And going to the original point, but it's relevant to what you've just asked, is that in addition to all of the actors in industry that need to be accountable, and all of the actors who are responsible for regulation, which includes, for instance, in some jurisdictions, private certifiers where regulation's been outsourced. I think, as touched on by Mohan and Shaheen, you've got what we call the standards and conformance infrastructure, the national conformance infrastructure, which includes those bodies that set the standards, write the codes, determine the testing regimes, etc. And so there's sort of three categories of accountability, but that last group, the National Infrastructure and Conformance Group, I think is very germane to your question about when they see it's appropriate to set requirements for retesting, batch testing, etc.
Thanks, Shaheen.
Thank you so much. So there are two things. One is periodic surveillance inspections, which is governed by ISO 17065, but then there's something else with regards to sampling that is not governed by 17065, and it depends on the scheme of the certification body. There are some bodies like ourselves, we go to the manufacturing locations and we do that paper audit and we look at the engineering change notices to make sure that the changes that the product has gone through has not affected the performance of the product to comply with the requirements of standard. But it's still not enough, because there are some major companies that go through 2,000-3,000 engineering change notices, and then again that sampling thing comes in. So as a result of that, we do select samples periodically, send them to a accredited test laboratory to retest to ensure that the product that we have certified continues to comply with the same requirements.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to move us on now. My next question is really around this subject that we've already started to explore a little bit about. Certainly two countries in the world where we have seen this problem lead to major disasters. The key question for me, though, is, does that mean those countries are different? There is something about our systems that have failed? Or is this a global problem and one that just hasn't happened yet in other parts of the world? I'd be interested in panel members' views on that. And Scott, I'm going to come back to you first.
Well, I don't know that I'm really qualified to answer that one, honestly, just because my dealings are only in, I'll call it, the developed countries where my tech works. So I don't really have experience in, say, Nigeria, because we're not really delivering products there. So I can't speak to that. Yeah, I don't think I should.
Okay.
I'm not qualified.
Do you think, maybe I can ask the question a different way. Do you think there is a risk in making an assumption that things are okay elsewhere? Should we, like something that gets talked about a lot in the chemical and oil and gas and major hazards industry is generate that sense of unease that this might be a bigger problem than we have evidence of thus far?
Yeah, again, I'm sorry. I don't think I'm qualified to answer that because
Okay.
I don't have experience
Okay.
directly.
Judy, what's your view? I mean, you spoke to this a little bit in your introduction.
I did, and I think that is, you know, a huge, that's the $1 million question is, do we assume that because this problem has been faced in a few countries that it is a globally pervasive problem? And like Scott, I don't have the answer to that, but I think it's certainly worth exploring in conjunction with looking at the different regulatory systems in different countries.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I think that my US colleagues have talked a lot about what I would refer to as redundancies in the US system that maybe would catch some of these things. But again, I don't think it's safe to assume that it's foolproof. And we always need to be looking to improve what we're doing and learning from the catastrophes and the disasters that happen around the world. But to Bronwyn's point, making changes that are appropriate and that go to the underlying cause. So I think, you know, looking at what the underlying cause is found to be, as the Hackett report has done, as the Shergold-Weir report has done, and then, you know, taking those findings and applying them to other markets to see if those same underlying causes exist and are pervasive, or if they are they otherwise mitigated through redundancies. But I think it's, you know, and the fact that we're having this conversation is important, it's relevant, and it needs to continue, and we need to continue to dig deeper and get you know, get more input from the global community.
Okay, great, thanks.
Dame Judith, if I could add.
Yes, please, Neil. I was just about to come to you. Yeah.
Okay. So I think obviously it is risky to assume that the problem is a universal problem, but it might not be unrealistic to assume that there is a problem that is experienced in different ways around the world, because our regulatory systems are different, our building industries are different. So how the problem manifests itself might be different. And as we know from talking to our American colleagues, and as has been outlined today, the fact that they have a far more prescriptive approach, the fact that they have much greater, in my opinion, regulatory oversight at the building interface may well mean that they do, in fact, have less of a problem with their products than has been experienced in the UK and Australia. But we also know, but we don't have the evidence, which is the point that Bronwyn was making earlier, that, for instance, with ACPs, ACMs, however they're described around the world, we know that there have been fires in Dubai. We know there have been fires in China. So other parts of the world have experienced what's happened in the UK and Australia, which means there is a problem there. We don't know how the problems manifest itself there, but there is a problem. We know there was a problem in Scotland with retaining walls. We don't know if that was specifically about a product or the way that the the retaining walls were designed. We know that there have been problems associated, for instance, with poor building construction in cyclonic areas or hurricane-specific areas in parts of the world. But again, we don't know if that's specifically product related or is it the way that the buildings have been constructed. So, you know, this is the call for, we need other evidence, we need information to assist us.
Agreed. And I think, you know, as you say, the fact that you raise the issue of some of the fires that have happened in other parts of the world where the consequences have not been as severe, I think points to something that was spoken about earlier, which is to what extent do failures in product get mitigated by other protection means attached to the building, whether that be sprinklers or whatever it might be. It's about the whole system, and in the event that a fire starts, how quickly get extinguished, and how much do those other layers of protection matter. So this becomes quite a complex subject. I agree. Okay. I'm now going to move on to this question of traceability. And Bronwyn, you referred to the fact that we have worldwide supply chains, products being sourced from all over the world, individual components moving from one place to another to make up products and so on. So when we talk so much about testing and performance assessment of products against standards, how well do we think that information is communicated through the supply chain? And in particular, like one of the things that I observed when I did my review was, if I compare this sector with many others, like the car industry or the white goods industry, the extent to which traceability has been embedded in those sectors versus construction, is there more that can be done to ensure true traceability of information? What I call part of that golden thread of information that needs to flow through this process.
Yeah, I think the construction industry is notoriously, certainly in Australia, discussed as being very slow to uptake technology. And there are other sectors, the ones that you mentioned, the car industry. I believe in maritime construction, there is a similar high degree of traceability, aviation, and those other sectors. The other interesting and quite different area would be food, traceability and ingredients labelling. And you've got, I guess, technology like barcoding and QR coding more recently that helps with those traceability controls, that has been rolled out much more extensively than it has certainly in Australia in the building industry. So there are a range of models that we can look to, and I guess the question is around what sort of investment do we need to make in those things. You also have to wonder whether the lack of transparency is perpetuated by some that enjoy the benefits of that and then resist creating transparency. And again, I'm not saying that this is the whole market or you know, that everybody is motivated by those sorts of things, but there can sometimes be some sort of, you know, darker reasons why the industry is not stepping up to these issues when there's plenty of examples and plenty of technology around that could be turned and transferred to be used in this industry.
I think that's true. I think also we have to recognise that sometimes some of those decisions not to be transparent are legitimately explained as being about commercial confidentiality and the need to protect formulations and so on. So there can be good reasons not to, but nonetheless, it still feels to me that there is more that can be done in this sector. Scott, is there anything you want to add on this? Because you talked a lot about information and traceability as part of what you said.
I guess a couple of thoughts. So we do some importation of products from Asia into the United States and other parts of the world. And I know that in that process, we do have ICCES inspectors actually going into those factories, just like the ones here in the United States, to verify that the manufacturing process is meeting the QC standards and the like. So, and then I think about traceability from, you know, if I go out to a job site and I found a box of our product, there's a label on that box, and I can trace that all the way back to the coil of steel that product came from. And and then I think about back on the last question, we looked at the you know, the product model, you know, changes to the product design, and that we always have to work through ICCS anytime we make those changes to those designs to verify they're correct. And on the we do test the steel that we use in the product on an ongoing basis. So these different coils of steel that come in for us to turn into a product, we test that, and we have rejected coils of steel because they didn't meet the ASTM standard. So we'll send it back, and the suppliers aren't particularly happy with us when we do that, but the have to. It's the, you know,
Sure.
the right
Sure.
thing to do. And I think too about the we actually have professional engineers that will go into the factory and talk to welders and say, let me explain this weld that you're doing and why it's so important. And so there's, because to a welder on the shop floor, you know, how important is this weld versus this weld? And so there's conversations that we have where there's genuine care in what we're doing. And when you have conversations like that going on, I'm not sure how that fits into the conversation, but I just thought it bared mentioning.
Okay, thanks very much.
Sure.
My next question is back on this subject of global supply chains. We've talked about traceability, but I think it's also important that we recognise that even since we produced this, did this work, the world has been changing around us, and in a world where global supply chains are now getting even tighter and more challenging, we've got inflation returning, which is going to add cost pressures to every part of the industry with a vengeance post the pandemic. Do panel members think that this adds to the risk? Does that create greater levels of substitution and as a result more risk of substandard or non-conforming products, either because of cost or availability? Mohan, what's your view?
Thanks, Dame Judith. What is it? My view is that I think when there is like you said, inflation, and when there's a high cost, there's always substitutions to what should be the actual standard that's going to be used for the product that's going to be used, and you know, cost or availability. Especially, I believe Judy mentioned about products being imported, or maybe Bronwyn did that, where she mentioned about products being imported from another, you know, from another economy to be used. Those are where, if those products are not in compliance with the standards used by the country that's going to use that product, then there could be issues with the conformance of the product. And I think the other more difficult thing to do is that, again, the case of a fraudulent product coming on discussion is there. You know, somebody could adulterate a product so that they could sell it at a lower cost and greater, you know, make more profits. And then once they sell the product, then they get out of the picture, and then, you know, that product causes problems later. So fraudulent issues are prevalent in this kind of areas. Thank you.
Okay, I think we've said before, this issue of fraudulence is a sensitive one. I think we also have to acknowledge that sometimes people do these things out of the best of intentions to get the job done. Mm-hmm. They feel under pressure, either from time or cost or whatever it is, to get on with the job. And one of the things that we haven't spoken about very much in this debate so far is competence. And I don't mean competence of the people who are doing the testing or doing the regulators. I mean the people on the job.
Sure.
Do we feel that there is an underlying issue of people feeling under pressure and making decisions that they're not qualified to make?
Do you want me to answer that question, or would you want to share?
Please, and then I'm
Yeah,
going to move on to Bronwyn. Yes, please.
Yes. I think the what do you call training of individuals in this industry is very critical. Certification, that is personnel certification, is very, very critical. If that's lacking along the way, definitely they will be making either a wrong call, or if there's pressure from above, they would make a quick call, which would then again be, would be a huge cost. But I think more importantly, accreditation, certification, and finally the issuance of a product in the market. Each one of these, they issue certificates of conformity. How to read and understand those certificates by the different levels is a very critical part of the personnel training that's required.
Yeah. Bronwyn and then Neil.
Yeah, look, I think competency is a major issue, and I think, and it's not necessarily saying that people are stupid or incapable or those sorts of things. There really is a question around what education do they have. When we have innovation happening all the time in the market, new products, as you mentioned, Mohan, we might have certificates or other complex documents that need to be interpreted. The actors involved in the chain aren't necessarily keeping up with those standards. There might also be an issue with the initial qualification that is being given to these different actors in the system, and how well they're being trained to account for innovation and change that is occurring quite rapidly, not just in the building industry, but globally. And so I think we have real issues with our education system. We then have these, you need to be able to control continuing professional development and upskilling. And what we see in the building industry is that sometimes this is delivered by the manufacturers themselves, who may or may not be, if we're talking about our issue 2 in our paper, they may be using those opportunities to engage with the market to push forward products inappropriately. And so you get this potential for conflict there as well. So there's a number of issues, and I do think a lack of competency is one of them. And it's not just in relation to the installers, it might also be for those specifying product, or for the approval authorities that are not necessarily keeping up with the levels of competency required to really navigate this very complex and changing space.
Thanks. Neil, anything to add on that?
If I could, and I know that when competence gets raised, it becomes very sensitive because some individuals and professions feel that it's part of the blaming exercise. But we cannot ignore this, and the work that we did in response to the Building Confidence Report certainly found and determined that competency was a key area that needed to be addressed. Some of the topics Bronwyn's already mentioned, but one thing I would like to add, and I did touch on it in my introduction, is the role of the client and the client's representative. And you could say that's an element of competence, but it's what's the driving motivation for them in a world where, as you say, costs are increasing through inflation, supply. Building products across the board in Australia have gone up roughly by about 30% in the last little while through supply issues, etc. So that's inevitably going to put pressure and require people to make choices. And of course, the other thing that we should bear in mind is that the Internet of Things has made products easily accessible to consumers who may unwittingly be purchasing products that don't conform, but once they receive them, they want their builder or their building practitioner to use those building materials.
Yeah. Okay,
Thanks.
thanks. Scott.
When I think about competence, one thing, there's a good example is Johnson County, Kansas, I believe it is, or Missouri. It's right on the border in Kansas City, Missouri. And they have continuing ed required for their contractors to do business in that county. And the contractors are all certified. They go through certification process and then continuing ed. And I know I've gone and taught classes for their continuing ed myself, so I've seen it. And they ask great questions. And you know, I just I wonder if there's a place for more of that in the building industry, to have the contractors, the installers be certified and through that education process. Just thanks.
Okay, thank you. There's some great comments coming in on the chat, by the way. Observations about things that have been found in different places. One interesting question though that I must pick up that has been placed in the Q&A session, and I'm going to paraphrase this now, but I think the nature of the question is about if we achieve compliance through making those responsible in the supply chain responsible for the safety of the people who do the work through occupational health and safety regulation, what difference does the panel think it would make if that occupational health and safety regulation were extended to cover harm that could potentially be caused to those who occupy the buildings, as opposed to just those who build them? Any thoughts?
I'm happy to venture a thought. Having been a project manager for construction, the one thing that focused my mind when I was a relative novice was discovering that I had some personal responsibility and liability for workers on site and those people who may ultimately utilize the facilities. I was working some distance away from the construction site in an office where I had many other people below me responsible for doing things. And I had a knock on the door from a safety official saying, guess what, you've got ultimate accountability. And it completely changed my attitude and approach to health and safety. So if that is an experience that could be carried across in some way, and I know that some thought has been given in parts of Australia, for instance, to making directors of building companies have some liability and accountability for the buildings that they produce, such that they can be chased if the companies were to become insolvent as individuals.
Okay, thanks, Neil. Thanks. Any other thoughts to offer on that before I come to my last question? Okay, this next question then is for all of the panel, and I'm going to ask each one of you in turn to come up with one answer to this, and please be brief. But the question is about what one thing would you like to see change, either at a national level or internationally, that would change or improve the current situation? I'll start with Bronwyn.
Thank you, Dame Judith. Very, very hard. I suppose looking at it through the Australian lens, what I would say is that we need to have better supply chain laws. It's a really huge gap in our regulatory framework in Australia. We have one jurisdiction that has introduced those, and for the rest of them, we rely on a very broad consumer protection regime, which at the moment doesn't cover it. So for Australia, that's what's important. I know your question was more about globally, but I can't help but look at it through our own scheme and the shortcomings that there are in that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Mohan, what one thing would you change?
I think the one thing is through training and education. I think people need to be educated so that they can ensure that non-conformance management is established within their respective organizations. Yeah, that's what I'd like to hope for.
Thanks very much. Thanks. Shaheen?
What I would do is I would get a group of people, whether it's through an international organization like ISO or other means, to look at the product approval systems around the world and make an assessment as to which one has worked the best in that particular geography, and see if that could be utilized in other parts and with improvements. So I would put a panel together to study different approval systems.
Interesting idea. Really interesting idea. Get some evidence of what works and what doesn't. I think that's a great suggestion. Judy.
Well, I was going to say competence, but I think Mohan covered that. And so I'll piggyback on that and say, I think in general, just the level of rigor needs to be improved throughout the whole process, not just with the competence of the practitioners, but the level of evaluation, the level of accreditation, the level of competency of engineers performing tests. So I think and I do think that there is some value in redundancy to protect against failure, because as people have noted, there is the opportunity for failure at many stages throughout the process. So establishing higher levels of rigor and redundancy, I think, would protect life.
Thanks. Scott?
Thought of two, and they've already both been hit on. One was competence, training, and for
That's okay. It's good to have consensus in the group.
Yes. And then the other one, I didn't think of it, but I loved Shaheen's idea.
Okay, thanks. Neil, final word is with you.
Okay, thank you. I would like to see digital information symmetry. That is to align relevant information from manufacturers' specifications and warranties through to test reports, compliance certification, professional judgments, product labeling, design specification approvals, delivery, installation, commissioning, through to owner maintenance manuals. This will enable transparent traceability of products, enhance auditing capabilities of regulators, improve accountability, and reassure practitioners and consumers.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that. And thank you to you all for your great contributions to this discussion today. That concludes this webinar. I just now want to remind all of our participants of our request to you to continue to engage with this process. We hope that you've been stimulated by the discussion that we've had. It's raised some thoughts for you, maybe prompted some thoughts of evidence that you may have access to that you would be willing to share with us. Any of those things we would really welcome. As I've said, this video has been recorded. It will be posted online so that we can share it with others, and indeed you can watch it again if you want to. But we'd also encourage you to tell your friends and your colleagues about it, because we want to build a community and raise the level of this debate. You will hear from us again when we've deliberated on the next steps, but we'd also welcome your suggestions on what those might be. So thank you all for attending today, and we will be back, as they say. But thank you for your attendance and your attention today. Thanks.